The Alliance to Restore the Republic was one of the two major belligerents during the Galactic Civil War. And although at times they did seem unorganized, the rebels actually did have a very formal military command structure. And today we're actually going to learn about that command structure and the various ranks within the rebellion's military. And because there is some confusion in legends and there's actually some contradictions depending on what video game or what source you look at, we're going to go with the canon continuity. So with that said, let's begin.
Get ready!
This is where the fun begins.
Now I am the master.
I got a bad feeling about this.
The lowest rank for a commissioned officer within the rebellion was lieutenant. And there would have been lesser ranks for non-commissioned officers and just regular troopers, but we're not going to go into those for today's video because they wouldn't have really had a whole lot of control over the rebellion as a whole. We don't know the specifics of how the rank of lieutenant would have worked in the rebel military, but it was probably something like real life, where a lieutenant is essentially the first step to becoming a higher ranked officer. So to be a lieutenant, you probably would have had some sort of formal officer training, but not much else. So for example, Luke became a lieutenant between episode 4 and episode 5. One thing I'm going to be discussing throughout this video is rank insignias, because each rank within the Rebel Alliance had its own symbol associated with it. And if you don't know what an insignia is, think of what the standard Imperial officer looks like. They usually have some sort of bar with different colors on it on the front of their shirt. And this easily communicates to everyone how important they are, what rank they are, etc. The Rebel insignias are actually quite simple. They just use dots, and the more dots you have on a square, the higher rank you are. So for a lieutenant, you have 1 dot only. The second highest rank after lieutenant is that of captain, and the insignia for that is 2 dots in a vertical line. So captains still didn't have very much power. On a small ship like the Tantive 4, they may be the highest officer on board, so they may be in charge. But on most larger ships, they'd be under either a major or a commander, and they'd probably just be a mid-ranking officer. Probably the best well-known captain that we see would be Captain Antilles, the guy who's choked out by Darth Vader at the beginning of episode 4. And as I alluded to earlier, he had full control over the Tantive 4. And although it could be argued that his rank is actually captain within the Alderaan military, the Rebel Alliance actually pretty much draws from their rank structure, so it would have been analogous. Next above a captain was a major, and their insignia was 3 dots with 2 dots at the top and 1 dot at the bottom, forming a triangle. And by the time you get to the rank of major, you could probably have some serious control. So you might be, the head officer on a medium-sized, maybe even a large ship, or you might have a whole base under your command. So speaking of bases, Bren Durlin was the major at Hoth, and he had full control over Echo Base. And he was the one who told the young lieutenant to close the blast doors when Han and Luke Skywalker were outside. But as it is with a lot of these positions, the exact power that the average major would have had is kind of unclear. I mean, it's only 2 ranks above the base commissioned officer rank of lieutenant. And I mean, you think to Echo Base, for example, that's a pretty important military asset to be controlled by, a 3rd rank officer. However, we also do know that on Echo Base there were generals and other commanders present who were kind of controlling the battle and issuing kind of the grand orders to evacuate, while the majors seemed to be more in control of the security and the operations of Echo Base itself. The next rank is commander, and the insignia for that is the major's insignia, but flipped on its x-axis. And again, as I mentioned, the actual hierarchy of power here is a bit unclear. I mean, we know obviously that they're above major, but we don't know how the duties and commands that they would have had actually differed. It seems like the commander probably had some sort of important function directly in battle, so they would command squads of troops. And likely in a battle situation, the lesser ranks of major, commander, and lieutenant would have operated under them. However, I'm sure that on some ships the commander was the highest ranking officer, so would have been the one giving out commands. And the same could probably be true for bases and other military installations. Above commander is colonel, and this is the rank where the officer would generally stop participating directly in battle and would focus more on kind of a grander strategy. This is, however, obviously a generalization, because we've seen the higher ranked generals and admirals participate directly in major battles. Think Admiral Akbar during the Battle of Endor, for example. The insignia for a colonel had 4 dots. 3 went from the upper left corner to the bottom right diagonally, and the 4th dot was in the bottom left corner. Again, there's some lack of clarity here, but a colonel's likely role would have been developing, the grand strategy in conjunction with the generals who they would have been under in rank. There are actually a few colonels who appear in the movies, but they're all as background characters and we don't really know exactly what role they have. So there's Aang Zaver, and he's in both Rogue One and Episode 4. Then there's Halton Daxo and Bandwin Kor, who both appear only in Rogue One. However, they're all kind of there at big planning moments on Yavin, so we know that they're at least probably pretty important. Similarly, on the Imperial side, there's Colonel Yularen, and he's there at the table talk in Episode 4, so he's obviously a very important person. You can assume that the roles are kind of analogous within each organization. So finally, there's the rank of General and Admiral, and it's kind of unclear how the two relate, and the real-world General would usually be reserved for the commander of the Army, and Admiral would be reserved for the commander of the Navy. I'm going to actually skip over to Legends for a second because I like the way that they kind of created the Alliance High Command, and I hope that the new canon does something similar. So we know from Rogue One that there's at least some form of Alliance Council, and that makes sense, but in Legends there was also the Supreme Allied Commanders, and these were basically the generals and the admirals who controlled the Alliance's military forces. And each High Commander was given their own area to work within, so there was Fleet Command, Ordnance and Supply, Starfighter Command, Support Services, Intelligence, Special Forces, and Sector Command. These Supreme Allied Commanders were all under the Chief of Staff, who was under the Minister of War, who was under the Commander-in-Chief. But yeah, it doesn't quite seem like the current canon is going to go that way, because we know that there is the Alliance High Command, as I mentioned, but that's made up of military and non-military members. So for example, Bail Organa was on the Alliance High Command, as were several senators. Most generals and even some majors and commanders and colonels were also on the High Command, so it's kind of unclear how the military and the rest of the High Command would have worked vis-a-vis military decisions. But we do see some military personnel getting involved in the decision of whether to attack at Scarif, which I guess you'd probably classify as a quasi-military decision. However, I'm sure if they had all agreed to actually start the attack, that it would have been the generals and the admirals solely making further strategic decisions further on. I should also note that the ranks of General and Admiral can be divided into several sub-ranks. So we know, for example, that Admiral Akbar is referred to as a Fleet Admiral, so presumably he would have had control over the entire Alliance Navy. And this is kind of analogous to the Grand Admiral on the Imperial side. Now, they most likely would have designated forces either through sector or through force size to lesser ranked admirals. And it's likely that generals would have treated their hierarchy in the same way. Some generals also seem to have the further position of chief, which seems to mean that they're the head of some specialized arm of the military. So for example, Aaron Kraken. You can see him in the back of the Millennium Falcon during the Battle of Endor, and along with being a general for the Alliance, he was also the chief intelligence officer. So he would have been in command of things like setting up spy networks. He was probably in charge of getting the Death Star 2 plans. I think you get the idea. So that's it, guys. That's the military command for the Rebel Alliance. I do just want to take 1 second and mention Mon Mothma, because she was the Chancellor or Chief of State of the Rebel Alliance and really the commander. However, she was the civilian commander, and it's kind of unclear to me how the civilian command and the military command would have worked, whether she could veto decisions made by the military officers and the generals. I'm not really quite sure, but that should be noted and just taken into consideration. Anyways, guys, thank you so much for watching. I think I'm going to do a few more videos on these command structures. I see one in the future coming for the Yuzhang Vong. I think the Imperial stuff has been done, but maybe I will also throw my hat into the ring on that. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, leave a comment and let me know if you enjoyed this video, and tell me, if you were in the Alliance, what rank would you want to be? And of course, may the Force be with you.